All right. Welcome to what is today, January 23rd, the OLM community meeting. And I suppose I'll be your host since I kicked off the recording. I'm Andy Goldstein, and we generally abide by the CNCF Code of Conduct, which in short is let's all be kind and awesome folks to each other. While I am getting set up here. If there is anybody who is new who would be interested in introducing yourself, please feel free. I'm just getting my screen share set up here. Alrighty, let me make the font a little bit bigger. Hopefully that is legible. Alrighty, so I am the host here, and we have a brief that I know Nikolai was working on about learning about possible updates. If you have not looked at that and you're interested, please do so. We would love to get comments within the next week or so. The lazy consensus date is February 6th. And I know that there'd been some back and forth on that late last week or earlier this week. So thanks for those who were participating. And that's all I will say on that. So I think the first discussion topic is on multi-tenancy that Joe had asked me to go over. So let me pull up that discussion and the post that I made. Give me just a second to do that. Multi-tenancy. All right, here we go. So there is a GitHub discussion in the operator controller repository about multi-tenant or shared clusters and considerations. And there was a very healthy back and forth discussion over the past several months. And I have been talking with some other folks like Joe and others about what is actually feasible and how many times are we potentially fighting against what Kubernetes intends and what it affords in terms of multi-tenancy concepts. In summary, I don't believe that the approaches that we were considering over the past 3 or 4 months are things that we should continue to pursue for a variety of reasons. And I am happy to go into those. But what I will also say is that we are not suggesting that multi-tenancy is a non-starter with OLM. It's more that we'll do less to force you to jump through hoops to get what you're after and try and get out of your way more. And as long as you conform to a minimal set of requirements and conventions, you probably can get what you're looking for. So I'll highlight what I have highlighted on the screen here because I think it's a good starting point. We've been using the term multi-tenancy to mean a few different things. And the use cases that I've been focusing most within this space are first, a non-admin user can install and update an operator in a namespace, self-service style, without requiring any administrator intervention or additional help from anyone else. Two, it's possible to install multiple copies of the same operator. Doesn't really matter if they're in the same or different namespaces, but we'll just say in different namespaces. And those multiple copies won't conflict in any way. And third, slight variation on two, you can upgrade any individual copy of an operator and the act of upgrading it will not impact any other copies or users of other copies in any way, really in any negative way. And starting with those three use cases, it's clear if you've been working in with Kubernetes CRDs and with Kubernetes for a while that Kubernetes is not designed to support any of these three use cases. First and foremost, you have to have permission to install a custom resource definition. Custom resource definitions are cluster scoped, global, and singular, and it is a highly privileged operation to modify the APIs that are available in Kubernetes via custom resource definitions. So you cannot install an operator that has CRDs unless you have sufficient permissions to install the CRDs. Second, around multiple copies and not conflicting and not impacting others. Anytime a CRD is upgraded, there could be potential breaking changes to existing data or things that used to be valid are no longer valid. And there's no way that we can guarantee that. So there's some things that we can do to try and mitigate to a degree, but I think if you go through and read everything that's here, what I'm thinking is that anybody can create the API or create an instance of the API that asks for an operator to be installed. My suggestion is that that is called extension. We currently have a cluster extension API that is cluster scoped, and my proposal is to rename it to extension and make it namespace scoped. Anybody who wants to, who has permission, can create an extension instance, and you have to have permissions to set up a service account that you would reference in the extension spec the same way that you would reference a service account from a pod spec or a deployment pod template. And you have to have permissions to do that. You have to have permissions to set up the service account so that it can do installation, upgrade, delete of everything that comes with the operator. And if you don't have permissions to do this, you have to ask someone else to do it for you, or someone has to grant you the permissions so that you can do it yourself. Next is, I mentioned already, you have to have permissions to create the extension. If you do, you have access to all the service accounts in the namespace, just like you do with pod. And then this is probably the biggest thing that I think makes OLM keep the cluster safe, but doesn't shut the door on multiple copies of things. So one and only one extension can own a given Kubernetes object. So if you wanted to install multiple copies of an operator, anything that's cluster scoped, CRDs, cluster roles, cluster role bindings, whatever else, you put in a separate bundle, like an API bundle, and then you have a different bundle that has the controller. And you'd you'd create an extension for whatever's cluster scope, the CRDs and whatnot, one time. And then you could create as many copies of the controllers as you wanted. And anyone who decides, I would like to upgrade the CRDs, that has to be a coordinated effort because there is only one copy of the cluster scope bundle. And presumably that's someone in some sort of administrative role. And we may decide to do some sort of CRD upgrade safety checks, but they would never be considered comprehensive or exhaustive or a guarantee that an upgrade is safe. And we potentially could record warnings for whatever we find and require that you acknowledge the warnings to proceed. This could be an optional thing. Some other parts of some other things could be optional as well. You could look at number three, for example, and say, well, somebody could write a component that automatically sets up all the RBAC that's needed whenever a user creates an extension. I don't think I'd necessarily recommend that if you're interested in secure by default and not having any privilege escalations, but it is certainly a possibility. So that was an overview. I know there's a lot more here, and there was some commentary, which was awesome. So Joe had asked me to present an overview of that today. We do have a separate meeting in 2 days on Thursday to talk about this in more detail with anybody who's specifically interested in multi-tenancy and shared clusters, but just wanted to give an overview today. And if anybody has any comments or questions or discussion, I would certainly welcome it. Tony.
Yeah, just a quick question. Can you scroll up to the proposed? Yeah, just help me to understand this a little bit. So on the point bullet number 5, so does that means I can still install an operator using that extension namespace called API, but my operator wanted to reconcile all the requests from all namespace?
Yes.
Okay, so say I install an operator um, that is watching all namespace, and then a few days later, another one who, assuming the operator already being separated using API bundle versus the controller bundle, and then there's another one who step in wanted to install another controller in a specific namespace, but my controller already reconciled the request from all the namespace. Does that will the OLM detect that and then block the installation of the second per
For
namespace
the
installation?
for the initial scope of work, just to get this out the door, no, maybe later.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay.
Any other thoughts?
Hi, this is Yanni. I'm also trying to understand. Perhaps I would take some more time to understand the proposal here, but maybe you can help me a bit using a scenario. I think we all know that the manager there are multiple versions of Cell Manager, one provided by the community, and Red Hat also has another Cell Manager operator. So from our client perspective, it's not uncommon that they run into the situation that they are not aware Cell Manager is running on the cluster, and then they try to install another one. So I guess that's maybe an example on how this new proposal may help. Like if you have different vendor provided operator that have the same capabilities, how do you handle it? Is that going to require like some manager to repackage to work with this new proposal, or is there any benefit from the proposal that would help the Cell Manager scenario, like running to the coexistence or the conflict in the installation on the same cluster?
If somebody has a cluster where they manually installed Cert Manager through Helm, for example, and then they went the Cert Manager operator route, which also tried to install Cert Manager, I would say the outcome would be unknown, and don't do that. We're trying to get something out the door as quickly as possible that covers a good chunk of use cases, but not all of them. And I think trying to adopt something that was installed out of band or even identify something that was installed out of band is not something we'd want to do. However, the CRDs for Cert Manager just like any other CRDs, are global. So if there's a CRD called issuers.certmanager.io that already exists in the cluster, you will not be able to install um, or you couldn't install cert manager via this mechanism. You could install the cert manager operator if that didn't include those CRDs, but I imagine it would. So that type of case probably uh, would need some just step-by-step brainstorming to see what the moving pieces are and what would work, what would fall apart, and whatnot.
Right, so you're thinking of having some sort of some safeguards when possible. For example, if OLM has fingerprints on these cluster scoped objects or shared objects, it at least would recognize, hey, I've already got someone else who's using these. But if there are no fingerprints on them, then we'd have to make some conscious decisions whether we throw warnings or block or overlay, right? So there's decisions that have to be made there.
Yeah, the default behavior would be to adopt whatever's there, which may not be desirable, but
Yeah, so
not,
steal. Okay,
yeah,
got it.
but that, so we're going to be switching to Carvel's cap controller, and that's how cap works.
That's like specifically one of the nuances that we need to figure out, like if that's the right default behavior for OLM2.
Yeah, so that behavior ends up becoming part of the spec, essentially. And so, yeah, we should absolutely document it, right, as a behavior, whatever that ends up being. Cool. All right. Yeah, yeah, as far as my team is concerned, yeah, James, who had been putting comments out in this discussion, we've been thinking about this for a couple of years. We haven't actually implemented it, this kind of concept, separating the extensions out, but I think we understand it. And I think it makes sense to me anyway.
Yeah, and Joe and I were talking this morning, and just doing some brainstorming on given existing catalog content, existing packages, existing bundles, would it be possible to take one that doesn't have any split and behind the scenes do the split for it and say, well, you've asked for the cert manager operator, but we're going to actually split it into an API bundle and the controller bundle. And there's some cases where we potentially could do that. There's other cases where we can't. Basically, if the binary that's running that has the reconcilers in it also serves the webhooks, which is probably close to 99 to 100% of the binaries out there, you can't run multiple copies of those. So there are nuances, and some things we may be able to do automatically and others that we won't.
Yep, that sounds familiar. Yep. So just one other question moving forward. So we've got multi-tenancy kind of documented in a couple of different spots. You've got a brief, or it's not a brief, it's just a Google Doc. And we've got this discussion. I think we've got an issue. Do we want to centralize this and maybe re-release a brief once we've kind of got?
Yeah, the current document that is the placeholder for the brief that's got a whole bunch of brainstorming in it,
Yeah.
we envision that content will be updated to reflect where we want to take this.
Okay. Yeah. A lot of people have links to that. So if we do decide to create a new document, probably just some kind of breadcrumbs to lead them to wherever the spot is. That'd be good.
Yeah, I don't think we'll need to make a new doc. Joe, did I miss anything from stuff we were talking about earlier that is worth highlighting?
I don't think so. We talked a little bit about some of the deletion aspects of this design where like deletion seems like it becomes a little bit less necessary for orphan cases because now we've separated the API into a separate thing, so you can delete and recreate controller extensions. So there's still some brainstorming on like what are the more broadly, I guess, like what are the implications of the fact that like we're thinking that the right way to do this is to do split outs on some of the other use cases and requirements.
So just real briefly, can you kind of remind me, so we have an operator API, right? We've actually got two, right? We've got the old V0 operator API, we've got the V1 operator API. So this extension is going to replace the current operator API in V1?
So the V1 API today is called cluster extension. It used to be called operator. It got
But
renamed.
it's operator in my OpenShift cluster. So that's what I'm looking at.
Yes, if you're using the OpenShift Tech preview, yeah,
Yep.
it's gonna be renamed to extension and become namespace scoped, assuming we all agree on this.
Yeah, okay. And then so a lot of the spec arguments I'm assuming would be very similar, right? So the contents of it would be essentially what the operator was doing before. So what we've been talking about here is now a pattern, and how do you stitch together multiple extensions? Because part of it's going to have APIs, some of it's going to have controllers or implementation behind that API. So it feels like it's going to get complicated. So I'm wondering if we want yet another concept that allows us to stitch those things together, and maybe that's going to happen as part of the dependency discussions that'll happen in the future. So
Yeah,
this seems like it might be a little low level.
um, as part of the initial work for this, my proposal along with Joe is that we don't do any dependencies. We don't do any tying together of things. If you want to install the cert manager operator and it has an API bundle and a controller bundle, you have to know to install the API bundle first, and then you can install the controller bundle. And once we have that working, then we can talk about how to make that simpler.
So right now we do have a dependencies YAML right inside of our V0 bundles. And I'm assuming we maintain support for V0 bundles in the new APIs, we would just ignore those and we'd have some kind of mode that basically stops ignoring them potentially in the future.
Something
Something
like
like that.
Okay. Or are you thinking maybe the dependencies would at least honor the dependency check, but not the provisioning, right? Because today bit dependencies does both. It ties, if the dependency is not there, it tries to provision it.
At a minimum, we'd be just checking that the dependency is there
Okay.
if to do the dependency stuff. There's a whole bunch of there's a big ball of wax with actually trying to manage the installation of the dependencies. So I think our
No, I'm happy if you divide that up. I've been wanting a feature that just did dependency checking versus provisioning.
I think right now we're thinking there is no dependency installation for you. Like we'll tell you, hey, this dependency is not met. And then you would go and need to manually create another extension for that dependency. So we have to work on UX for what that would mean for like deep dependency trees, but potentially tooling can help with that.
Yeah, I guess one of the concerns I have is in the very first prototype or the first version we release, if it doesn't do any dependency work, then the dependency YAML, we can't start using it silently because it'll break everything. And so we'd have a precedent we'd have to deal with.
if you have an example of one of these big operators with a bunch of dependencies, could you give us a link to it? That'd be really helpful.
Sure, I can find one.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be right now when you get a
Yeah,
chance.
we've got some that have a combination of GVK dependencies and then ones that have now package dependencies. I don't think we have anything that uses like cell, any of those things. We've kind of shied away from that because they're kind of complicated. But yeah, I can absolutely dig something up.
And is your desire that you can essentially say, go install operator X, and the net result is like 20 different operators get installed?
Not personally, no. because I think, as Joe had alluded, there's a whole ball of wax involved, and we can get wrong things, right? The rules
Yeah.
are, there's a whole precedence, namespace versus catalog source versus, there's just all sorts of things that can happen with conflicts. I guess I haven't formulated an opinion yet. So internally, we are slowly backing away from expressing dependencies in OLM, and we are slowly moving towards, external orchestrators, whether they be scripts or other operators to describe those, because that we increasingly need dependencies to be dynamically provisioned on first use or when we have optional capabilities that are enabled. So being able to, provision these 20, operators, even though some of them aren't used, is very problematic. And then in addition, really the whole point of the operator for us is a way to manage the operand. So really, we really want dependencies for the operands more so than we want the operators. So that even makes our external orchestrator even that much more critical to work. And our external orchestrators, we've got combinations of several of them. we've got one orchestrator that runs as a command line tool. We've got one that runs as an operator. We got a couple that runs as operators, and then lots of scripty ones out there.
Okay.
Of course, we want GitOps too, which doesn't work right now. But
okay, Tony, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, so also similar questions to the dependency. I know we probably doesn't have a lot of details on this, but just a use case is that say my operator depends on Elastic, and then this operator declared the dependency using the API, and then during the installation, that Elastic operator actually already been installed, but the controller is just reconciling a specific namespace one, but not my operator watch namespace. So I wonder, in this kind of situation, OLM probably need to have some kind of watch scope detection so that, other than looking at the API does exist, but still, checking whether or not the target namespace is actively reconciled by the already existing controller. So just wanted to reinforce that, we probably need to kind of have a mechanism to detect the watch scope, so we can either check in for the newer installation, is there any overlapping between the watch scopes, or during the dependency resolutions, the API required by your operator already have and controller exists and is also actively reconciling your target namespace or not. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the can of worms that Joe and I were punting on.
Gotcha.
We have some ideas there, but it's complex. So I think our thought was, let's get sort of the base installation, upgrade, delete flow all working with some of these tenants. And then once all that works, then we can start talking about, well, how does this work with a constraint system? And understanding the watch namespaces is part of that.
Gotcha. Thanks.
All right. Obviously we'll discuss this again on Thursday for the folks that we're planning on attending that multi-tenancy meeting on Thursday to talk. So for those of you who are here for today's intro, I think you'll have a good background for what we're going to talk about on Thursday. So that'll be helpful. Alrighty, if there's nothing else on this, let me just put a link to the doc in here. I'm going to skip the milestone check-in because I don't think we need it. So any other topics? Going once. Ankita, I've seen you unmute a couple times. Did you have anything?
I just wanted to bring up that we have the a brief that is up for review if folks want to take a look at it. So that's up there too.
Which one is it?
The learn about possible updates.
Okay, yeah, you might have maybe not been on the call. I did mention that at the beginning, but thank you for bringing that up again. All right, let's call it a meeting, and you all get 23 minutes back, and see some of you on Thursday and everybody online. Thanks.